All right, welcome to those who are just joining us. Thank you for joining us today. We're gonna wait for folks to kind of start to join us here. But while we do, we are going to go ahead with a quick poll for our attendees. So while we're waiting for everybody to join, we are gonna launch this quick 3-question poll to learn a little bit more about how you're thinking about vaccine incentives. So while we're waiting for folks to pile in here, please go ahead and let us know kind of what your organization is planning on in terms of vaccine incentives as you are thinking a little bit more about that. We will get started in just a minute or two when we have a few more folks. As folks are just joining us, we'll get started about maybe 3:02. Welcome to those who are just joining. While we're waiting for everybody to get in and get settled, we've got a vaccine incentive poll to learn a little bit more about what you're thinking about and where you are in terms of considering vaccine incentives, understanding whether your employees are intending to get vaccinated, and learning a little bit more about that. And we'll talk about all of those issues today in the next hour or so. If you haven't yet voted in the poll, feel free. And all right, I think it's about time that we can get started. I'll leave that poll open for a couple more seconds. So, you know, don't hesitate to let us know. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and introduce kind of the 3 folks who are joining us today. We have first and foremost, I'm Jen. I work with 0 Hour Health and Zedic, and I'll be our moderator today. And I would love to introduce our 3 panelists for today: Roslyn Stone, who is the CEO of 0 Hour Health and the founder of Zedic; Claire Deason, who is a shareholder at Littler Mendelson Employment Law. Claire focuses on wage and hour things in particular, and especially focuses on compliance and litigation. She leads the core team around wage and hour practice group at Littler Mendelson, who's one of the leading kind of employment law firms in the country. And then we're especially joined for the beginning of our webinar today by Dr. Monique Foster, who is a medical epidemiologist from the CDC's US Public Health Service. And we are so excited to have all 3 of you on today. Thank you so much. Roslyn, you want to just say hello, and then we'll kick it off to Dr. Foster, who can start us off. Oh, you are muted. Sorry about that.
There we go. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. We, as you probably are aware, questions surrounding vaccine and vaccine hesitancy, vaccine incentives, and how to go about giving vaccines and tracking vaccines have been the issues of the month, of the week, and we're really excited to have this panel today. Dr. Foster has another commitment. She's going to kick it off and talk to us about vaccine hesitancy, and then we'll circle back around, talk about incentives, and then talk about the issues related to getting vaccinations and tracking them. Dr. Foster, thank you, and really appreciate your joining us here today.
Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So I know that a lot of you might have dealt with vaccine hesitancy when undergoing the large hepatitis A outbreaks that have been going across the nation and still go on. A little bit of that attention, of course, is taken away from the COVID pandemic that we're experiencing now. But Roslyn thought it'd be a good time now that the COVID vaccines are out, to kind of revisit how to deal with vaccine hesitancy. And I kind of like to break it down into general areas that people tend to use when they are concerned about receiving a vaccination, particularly if it's from a new vaccine. Some people just need some basic knowledge. They want more knowledge about the vaccine, how it was manufactured, what are the side effects, how it will benefit them. And then some folks are hesitant to receive vaccination because of their perception of risk. They don't think that they are going to get infected with whatever it is that the vaccine is preventing. They just don't think that they will be very sick if they do get infected. I think you see a lot of that in the media now, that COVID is not that serious, things like that. So perceptions of risk is another big bucket. Kind of as a sub bucket of that, as I've already mentioned, symptoms and perception of severity. Even if I do catch this disease, it's not going to be that serious. We hear the same thing with hepatitis A. Sure, you just turn yellow for a few days and no one really dies from hepatitis A. And we know that's true. And we kind of hear the same things about COVID. It's not that serious. Most people recover. And then we get into the bucket of vaccine concerns. And this kind of gets into your anti-vax group, where people think that, the vaccine's going to alter their DNA, or if it's some tracking device from the government. And unfortunately, studies show that when you talk to those people about vaccine hesitancy, I'm a pediatrician by training, so I do my best to educate and get people vaccinated. But there is a group of people that studies show the more you ply them with education, the more resistant they're going to come to vaccination. So that kind of bucket of people who are really concerned based on conspiracy theories, I'm not sure how much energy you want to put into that, and you might want to concentrate on addressing issues in those other two buckets. And then lastly, it really is kind of circling back to basic knowledge, the scientific literacy of the group that you're talking to. You have to really adjust your education and your knowledge that you're sharing with them to their level, so they understand the benefits to be vaccinated. So just kind of examples of what you're hear from each of those buckets. So the basic knowledge, unawareness. I've never heard of hepatitis A. I can't believe anyone would say they've never heard of COVID, given what we've all endured for the last year. But sometimes it's just a basic education of what the disease and what the vaccine is for, preventing that disease. When we get into the perceptions of risk, a lot of times you'll hear, I'm healthy, I don't need to be vaccinated, I'm not at risk, I wear my mask all the time, I take all my precautions, why would I need to be vaccinated? And the potential responses are, even though you feel healthy, COVID, hepatitis A, any of these diseases can affect anyone. And it's really the point of the vaccination is to keep you healthy. It's not to make assumptions about your health. Again, symptoms, that perception of severity, well, I never get sick. I have a husband who does not believe in the flu vaccine because he's like, it'll give me the flu, those kinds of things. Again, you just want to fight with education. Even people with strong immune systems can get sick with COVID or other diseases. Some people, I don't care if I get sick, but maybe you want to protect your family members, the people that you interact with, and not to put a dollar sign on anything, but protect your livelihood. If you get sick, you're going to have to be away from work, and that's just a mild illness that leads you to hospitalization. If you get your family members sick, you might have to be away from work to take care of them. As employers, you might have to pull that employee so they don't risk infecting anyone else. So that will lead them to be away from work. So, not to put everything on the bottom line, but sometimes people respond to the financial incentives, which is probably a little bit different than what Claire's going to talk about, but the financial incentives of not missing out on work. And you can never guarantee that the vaccine is not 100%. You can't make those guarantees, but it gives them a leg up, Then you've got vaccine concerns themselves that are kind of separate from that anti-vax box. People are afraid of needles. It's not something kind of, gloss over. Many people feel that way. I've received my first dose of the vaccine. I'm getting my second dose on Friday, and I will tell you, it's quick. I thought that it was less painful than the flu needle, flu vaccine. It's nothing like tetanus or anything like that. So you can only do what you can to inform folks about, the benefits outweighing the fear of needles. And then, of course, the big one, like I said about my husband and the flu, will the vaccine make me sick? These vaccines for COVID are not inactivated virus. They are not going to kind of react in your system and give you COVID. People who unfortunately get COVID after they've been vaccinated already had COVID before they received the vaccine. So it's kind of a hard thing to explain, but that kind of knowledge is helpful, and giving that education is helpful to some folks. But there's no reason that the COVID vaccines that are being used in the United States will give someone COVID. It just can't happen the way that these vaccines have been manufactured. You will have an immune response. Now, I keep referring to my husband because he's someone that I have to overcome vaccine hesitancy with. But he is convinced that the flu shot gives him flu, and that is really his immune response. And that's a good thing. So your immune response can make you feel achy, it can make you feel sore, it can give you flu-like symptoms. They typically only last for 12 to 24 hours after vaccination, but it is easy for people to have that feeling. Well, I was feeling great until I got that vaccine, and suddenly I'm achy, I've got a fever. What happened? And it really is your immune system revving up and protecting you against that disease. So for me and my family, I've been kind of prepping my husband. He's already received his first vaccine. Everything in the media says it's really the second vaccine that gives you that robust immune response. And I have been prepping him since he received his first one. You're going to feel achy. You're going to be sore. When you get your second one, maybe get it on a Friday like I'm planning to do, so you have the weekend to recover. So I'm just kind of, hammering it into his head that when he gets that second shot, he's going to feel achy. He might have some fever, high temperatures. It is just his immune system showing that it works and that he's going to be protected. Also kind of circling back to the incentives that are not incentives. Another thing that's been moving my family, I got calls from my brothers about asking whether they should get the vaccine, is just that kind of return to normality. We're big travelers. I just want to get on a plane and travel that's not associated with work. I want to eat in a restaurant without feeling freaked out about eating inside. So, even if you're not giving monetary incentives, gift cards, just discussing on what's going to help us get back to doing the things that we enjoy without that kind of baseline fear, I think helps a lot with reasonable people. So with that, I've sent Roslyn a kind of vaccine concerns. It's very hepatitis A focused, but I think it's a hesitancy guide that you can use and adapt in different circumstances. I do apologize that I do have to run to another meeting, but Roslyn and Jen, I'm sure will collect any questions that you may have for me that maybe I can answer offline through an email. With that, I'll turn it back over to you guys. I'm sorry to run.
No problem. Thank you so much for joining us. We know you're very busy and probably doing these back to back to back. So thank you so much. Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Dr. Foster. And now we'll kind of flip it over, keeping that line of the incentive around returning to normalcy, which for me personally is a very compelling argument. We're going to talk a little bit with Claire Deason, again, shareholder at Littler Mendelson Employment Law firm, to talk a little bit about this. But before we do, a quick transition is that I can quickly share the results of our poll, which you can see now, which is that many of you are probably attending today because you're not sure yet whether you're going to incentivize vaccination. We know that it's a bit early for most of our, for most states, for employers to really be ready to vaccinate. We know that the rollout is in process still. Looks like there's a lot of uncertainty around what type of incentive, or a lot of variation rather about what type of incentive people are considering, with most people considering something other than the choices here. I also didn't include a don't know yet for that one, so that might be some just folks that are still trying to figure that out. And then a lot of folks have not yet surveyed employees to figure out if they intend to get vaccinated, although about 30% of us, 30% have, and another 20% are planning to. So about half have surveyed and may have a little bit more to understand how many of their employees are getting vaccinated. So that's where we're at. And Claire, we are so excited to have you here because so many of us are not sure yet about incentivizing vaccination.
That's great, because hopefully I'll be able to give you all a little bit of super geeky wage and hour information to help you make this decision. So first, just as a bit of background, wage and hour law is not really the first thing that you think of when you think of a pandemic global health crisis, but it is super critical. And for any of you who have lived through the terror and chaos of a collective action or a class action over wage and hour topics, you will know why the things that we are talking about today are super critical. To put it mildly, mildly in the world of wage and hour is a couple $1 million. Even one well-intended mistake in a calculation of a payroll issue or a regular rate calculation, which is one of the things we'll talk about today, can result in millions of dollars of liability. So even just one little thing. So keep that in mind. That's why I'm here. That's why I love to do what I do. So I'm really glad that Dr. Foster talked about kind of the flip side of incentivization of behavior. What are we trying to avoid? The awfulness of COVID and the awfulness of being stuck at home. Yes, let's avoid it. But what else can we do to incentivize behavior? In the non-pandemic world, I do a ton of incentive comp drafting, reviewing sales commission plans for our clients, all sorts of fun, normal, non-pandemic stuff like that. And frankly, vaccination incentive planning is very similar to the same kind of concept. We want to never lose sight of the fact that we're trying to encourage and persuade perhaps people to do something that they might not otherwise have the ability or the interest or the commitment to do. So there's really a couple wage and hour topics that we have to think about when we're thinking about pay and vaccines. The question on everybody's mind is, must we, can we, should we, how do we pay people to get vaccinated? Is this a thing? Yes, it is definitely a thing. It's kind of the only thing I've been doing for the last 14 days or so. So yeah, it's totally a thing. The first part of this is, I'll cover this just briefly, and that is, does an employer have to pay for the actual time that an employee is spending getting vaccinated? Is it working time where a non-exempt employee should be on the clock, just like they're at work? And to answer that question, we really need to consider whether the employer is requiring the vaccine, the jurisdiction where the employee is working. The principal work of the employee is really critical. If the vaccination plays a role in the employee's job duties, that's a factor to consider. And then also any sort of employer imposed requirements for the timing and the location of the vaccine. Some of you might be considering things like that, and they are going to come into play in the evaluation of whether the time spent getting vaccinated is actually working time where someone needs to be on the clock. Both federal and state law always come into play in any wage and hour issue. In states that follow the federal FLSA and the Portal to Portal Act, really generally speaking, vaccine time should be paid if the vaccination is occurring on the employer's premises or at the direction of the employer. So if it's mandated vaccine, that sort of thing. And during the employee's normal working hours on days when the employee is working. So if you think about something like an on-site vaccination clinic where the employee is required to go and get the vaccine unless they have a disability or a religious reason not to, that would be something to think about in terms of that regulation. This is a FLSA reg that comes up and covers the compensability of time spent on medical care. So under this federal law, if the employer recommends but doesn't require that employees get vaccinated, the time spent getting the vaccine is really likely not going to be compensable. That is, unless the vaccination occurs on the employer's premises during the employee's working time. But that's not all. Now, if the vaccination is occurring outside of the employee's working time in a state that follows the federal law, it might still be compensable working time if the vaccination itself is integral and indispensable to the employee's principal activity. And that's where the work of the employee and the function of the employer really comes into play. An activity is going to be integral and indispensable if it's an intrinsic element of the employee's principal work, one that the employee cannot dispense with if they're going to perform their principal activities. So the reality of this is that healthcare industry employers in particular, but really all employers, need to work super closely with their outside counsel, with their inside counsel, to determine whether the factual circumstances of the vaccine program that they're considering, whether the industry and the uniqueness of their workforce is going to necessitate actually paying for the whole time that the employee is spending getting vaccinated. And we want to also consider the implications for travel time, prep time, and how to get the employee time off from work under those sorts of interpretations. And also remember, of course, not every state follows the FLSA, the interpretations that I just walked you through. For example, California's definition of time worked also includes the time that an employer suffers or permits employees to work, as well as time that's spent under the control of the employer. When is an employee under the control of an employer in California? That is an analysis that's completely different than the analysis under the federal law. In California, it's a lot more likely that time that current employees spend receiving a required vaccine, no matter where it happens, no matter when it happens, might very well be seen as time that's spent under the employer's control and is compensable hours worked. And of course, even if you're not requiring the vaccine, and even if you're not controlling where and when it's happened, you might still decide that you want to pay employees for the time that it takes to get the vaccine. In fact, many of you answered the survey that way. Actually, particularly if an employer is not requiring the vaccine, keeping our ultimate focus always on incentivizing the behavior. We want to find a way to encourage employees to get vaccinated if they're able. So really the next question is, how do we do that? How do we incentivize vaccination? So as you can see from the survey, a lot of folks are considering things like gift cards, paid time off, extra vacation time, cash bonuses. My favorite is a coffee machine for anyone who gets vaccinated. Not very many of my clients are taking me up on that advice. I keep suggesting coffee machines and no one is following that advice, but it's all right. I give good advice everywhere else. So whenever there's a promise of a thing of value tied to an employee activity, your little red flag wage and hour risk thing should go off in your mind and tell you we have to remember the regular rate of pay. If you are a wage and hour geek like me, this should be the first thing that pops into mind. So that's the rate at which non-exempt employees are paid overtime. Non-exempt employees should not be paid overtime just at time and a half their hourly rate. If they're getting additional compensation and that compensation needs to be included in that rate, the rate is different. It needs to be time and a half the regular rate. So the real question is, do we need to adjust the regular rate to include the value of an incentive that we're giving to employees to get vaccinated? This really depends on whether any of the regular rate regulations apply. And the answer to that question is no one knows. We've never done this before. We've never really had vaccine incentives as a normal thing in typical employment law and payroll practices. So we need to kind of do our best to look at the regs and think about the particular program and decide what interpretation makes the most sense. So there is no regulation that says if you give a thing of value to an employee in order to encourage them to go get a vaccine, then you can exclude that thing of value from the regular rate. But there are regulations that tell us that payments for time spent not working typically don't need to be included in the regular rate. But the question is whether a flat sum bonus, $100 cash, a $25 gift card, can be a payment for time in this context. We also know from the regulations that the cost to the employer for providing a wellness perk can be excluded. Actually, that regulation even tells us that the cost of a vaccination clinic can be excluded from the regular rate. But what it doesn't say is if that cost can also include benefits that are paid directly to the employee, or is it just the cost to the employer? That's kind of an unknown. This is all to say it's really fact specific and should definitely be a consideration when you're setting up a particular incentive program to incentivize vaccines. You'll have to make that decision with your counsel. So let's say you make that decision and you're either going to do it or you're not. That's up to you and your lawyer. If you do decide to adjust the regular rate, you're going to say, let's not even worry about those regulations. Our payroll team is ready to do this. We're going to make that adjustment. We do it all the time with bonuses and things like that. Well, if you're going to do that, then the next question is, we have to very clearly determine the work weeks in which the bonus is earned, because those are the work weeks when the regular rate needs to be adjusted. And for those of you with employees in California, any incentive payment that's made as a flat sum bonus, like $100 cash or a $25 gift card, is going to need to be paid, and the regular rate calculation will have to be in compliance with California law regarding flat sum bonuses, which is different, of course, than the FLSA calculation method. So then let's also say you make the decision to exclude the incentive payment from the regular rate. You and your counsel get together, given the particular vaccine program, we think it's totally fine to leave this payment out of the regular rate. Well, then it's a good idea to weigh the costs and the benefits of providing PTO or vacation time instead of flat sum cash or a gift card incentive. I say this because I think this type of an award, additional vacation time, for example, might very well be more likely to be considered a payment for time under the regulation that allows employers to exclude payments for time not worked. So you might have a better chance, you might feel more comfortable, for example, excluding the incentive from the regular rate if the incentive is time instead of money. But of course, time sometimes isn't as incentivizing as money. Vacations might not be as incentivizing as cash, although they sound pretty nice right about now. But particularly for employees with unlimited vacation time, extra vacation time, frankly, is meaningless. And for employees whose vacation time banks don't roll over or don't cash out at the end of the year under the employer's policy, it might not be all that exciting to get a few extra hours added to the pot when we're not going to actually see those hours in the form of cash or be able to use them anytime soon, since we're all stuck at home. So at the end of the day, if the incentive program isn't actually incentivizing, which is the whole point, then why bother? So we always need to keep our eye on that ultimate goal and navigate the path of crafting the right program, keeping in mind that what we're trying to do is incentivize something and still not get into trouble with wage and hour laws. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, great. We'll get to questions in just a bit. I'm sure many of you have some questions, so feel free to drop them into the Q&A section, and we'll spend at least the last probably 20 minutes of this webinar going straight with questions. One thing I didn't say, but I'm just going to say it one more time explicitly, is that none of the responses today from Claire or Roslyn or Dr. Foster are legal advice. Every situation is different. You should consult your own legal counsel. This is just a general overview of the legal landscape. And so you'll probably hear us say that a couple more times, but just to keep in mind, especially as you start to ask specific questions, remember that you should be running all this by your own counsel. So, so with that, we'll go to our last topic before we go to our live Q&A, which is vaccination and tracking. How do we track it? How do we keep it, understand where people are getting vaccinated, when, what it means for you as an employer? So Roslyn, go ahead and take us away.
Thank you. Usually we start out these webinars with a quick wrap up of or overview of where we are with COVID today. I think we're in many ways sort of going to skip over that because I think everybody knows we're seeing case counts drop down right now. We all hit really, all of our clients hit peak numbers a week to 2 weeks ago. And we've seen sort of a nice decline in both exclusions and positive cases in the last 2 weeks. We are somewhat terrified about the upcoming weekend. Well, 10 days from the upcoming weekend. We understand that up to 30% of employees, according to a survey done by the National Retail Federation and an identical survey done by Seton Hall University, found that 30% of people intend to attend Super Bowl parties. So our next surge event might be upon us, and we hope that it's not, and we hope that you'll find ways to message to your employees about that. So I'm just going to roll into, excuse the pun, vaccine rollout issues. You've read about them all over the news, and I'm not going to recount every single one, but we're seeing issues with not enough vaccine, varying scheduling systems, difficult to navigate scheduling systems, not enough appointments when there is vaccine, and now in the Northeast or the whole East Coast, and I think across much of the country, we've had weather issues this week. So I live in New York State, and every vaccine appointment, for the most part, in the southern half of New York, got canceled for Monday and Tuesday. So first there were no appointments, then people got appointments after they stayed up and found the tricks of scheduling after midnight and those kinds of things, and then had their appointments canceled. So we've certainly hit some major bumps. There have been there's some more vaccine coming out now. We understand that the states may get a 20% increase in the vaccine that's being shipped to them. There was originally 16%. We don't know if this 20% is in addition to the 16%, or whether the 16% is now 20%. We'll hopefully have more information about that by the end of the day. But we are seeing more vaccine availability. We are seeing vaccines, the classes of employees and essential workers now being eligible for vaccination, that restaurant workers and other essential workers are falling into the next vaccination categories in many states. And restaurateurs in New York were celebrating yesterday when Uber drivers and restaurant workers were moved to 1B. So what that means, though, is hard to say because there's so little vaccine in New York. So moving on to vaccine tracking. I'm going to show you this is my own card. This is my dose 1. The same card is being used across the country. It's a paper card. The concept of your employees hanging on to these cards is one that everyone is struggling with. I certainly have kept mine, carefully, but I'm not sure that I could count on every one of my employees, or every one of your employees to keep track of it. There are a number of electronic passports or vaccine tracking passports. There's a number of ways that these records are electronic. You are uploading your dose information after your vaccine into the CDC tracking system. And if you know your login and password, you could pull up your record in that way. We're hearing more and more about vaccination passports and their applications to get us back to traveling, that we may need it to get into certain facilities, or to be able to enter a theater or to enter a ballpark. We do know that Denmark was one of the first countries to announce that you would need to have an electronic vaccination passport to travel around and into Denmark. We know that the airlines that service the Middle East started using vaccination passport that they send you information about when you purchase a ticket, and that starts for them next week. We think that, or we hope that this will lead to some renewed travel, but all of this is still evolving. The question that you've asked us most is, will our work exclusions change once our employees have been vaccinated? And the feedback that we have at this point in time from the CDC is no, unfortunately, no. We're missing this very, very key piece of information about vaccines. And that key piece of information is whether or not you can still transmit the virus even though you've been vaccinated. We know that with many other vaccines, the answer is yes. You may not get as sick. You may have an illness of a shorter duration. You may not get sick at all, but you often can still transmit the virus even though you've been vaccinated. None of those studies have been done yet. It takes at least 6 months of being vaccinated to start those studies for clinical trials. So it's going to be some time before we know whether or not vaccination is going to prevent transmission, and we know that there are many reasons to believe it won't. I did want to talk about vaccine tracking and why it's important for you as employers, or the considerations for you to make as you decide whether or not to track your employees' vaccinations. We think that there are some very important pieces of information that you need to have. First, if you are going to incentivize or compensate, and this is a question that we may circle back with Claire, can you require proof of vaccination in order to provide the incentive or the compensation? But for those, many of you who have already decided on incentives know that you want to see some kind of proof of vaccination. There are other reasons to want that proof of vaccination. One is so that you may make decisions later on, whether or not exclusions change, you may make decisions or considerations about who can work when. For example, now, when there's a hepatitis A outbreak in a restaurant or other workplace, there may be a period of time where only vaccinated employees are allowed to work under the guidance of the local health department. Will we get someplace like that with COVID? Are there times where COVID is surging in an area where we want to give some kind of preferential scheduling or only allow vaccinated employees to work during that outbreak period? And then last but not least, by tracking who received which vaccine when, then you can also be part of prompting your employees if they need a booster dose, if there's a recall, if it's a vaccine that requires an annual, an annual additional dose. So we believe there are many reasons that you have no choice but to track the vaccination. It certainly raises other legal questions that are outside of my bailiwick. How are we talking about tracking vaccinations? Ours is pretty simple. Many of you who are on this call are using our electronic daily wellness checks. We are incorporating two forms of vaccine tracking into our check. The first one that we're incorporating is for a manager to be able to look at someone's card, pull down of the employees at their location, enter dates 1 and 2 for the 2-dose series, enter a single date for the Johnson & Johnson and whoever else comes out with a single dose vaccine, and the manufacturer. And the manufacturer is really important, again, because if there are recalls, if we know that one particular brand of vaccine doesn't provide protection from a particular variant that's circulating, it gives us more information about how to keep our employees and our customers safe. The second way that we're tracking vaccines as an alternative way is that employees, as part of their daily wellness check, can answer a question that they got vaccinated recently, they got their second dose or their final dose recently, and can themselves update both the dates of vaccine 1, vaccine 2, or their final dose, and take a picture with their phone of their card and upload it into the system where we store it following the proper storage guidelines. So that's a very, very quick overview. I know many of you have a lot of questions. I'd like to turn it over to Jen to collate or aggregate the questions.
Excellent, thank you. And if you wouldn't mind, could you stop sharing your screen? There you go, you already did, you were ahead of me, so that we can see everybody's faces. Lovely. We have a lot of questions rolling in about all of we've covered a lot of different kind of topics that are all interrelated. But I will start with a couple. We've gotten probably our most popular question in a couple of different forms. This is for you, Claire, which is that basically knowing that there is a percentage of the population who either have medical or religious objections to vaccination, they have a reason that they're advised not to get the vaccine, that there are going to be people that don't get vaccinated. How should that or how will that affect incentives in general, or even a company's liability?
That's a really good question.
Great question.
Yeah, so it's going to depend. Classic lawyer answer, bear with me. It's going to depend on whether the incentive program and the vaccination incentive program and whatever vaccination program the employer might have too is part of a wellness program under how the EEOC and the ADA defines those types of programs. Essentially, the general rule is that if in any wellness program, if there's an incentive to participate in the program, it needs to also be available through some sort of accommodation process to folks who are unable to participate in the program because of religious or disability challenges. So this comes up, of course, when we are offering a meaningful incentive. The EEOC has said you can offer a modest incentive to participate in a wellness program. I know that one of our attendees has asked, is it de minimis? Is it modest? Frankly, I'm not really sure what the difference is. The EEOC hasn't really told us that. But actually just yesterday, several employer groups, including chambers of commerce, submitted a letter to the EEOC and asked them, please clarify, how do all of these things apply to vaccine incentives specifically for COVID? And I know we're all dying to get that guidance from the EEOC because it's unclear, frankly, what type of incentive might tip something into a wellness program, what kind of parameters for earning the incentive might convince the EEOC that it's something that needs to be offered equally even to folks who can't participate in the incentive program. Where the rubber really hits the road for me is this is a really wonderful opportunity for an employer and a good time to be sure that you have robust, accessible, easy to understand accommodation processes, and that your HR folks and your managers on the ground are actually prepared to address those kinds of questions.
And that you're consistent in applying them. That's the question we get a lot. Can we leave it up to a location manager? Can we, and making sure it's consistent is really critical.
Exactly. And so in that process of, evaluating the accommodation process, getting folks ready to be able to address these questions. What do we do when an employee comes to us and says, hey, everybody else is getting a $25 gift card, but I'm pregnant and the CDC told me that I should not get vaccinated because it's still experimental. So that doesn't seem fair, right? First off, we need to be sure that the person who that question is brought to knows how to handle it. What does the accommodation process, what does the request for accommodation process and policy for the company tell us to do with a request like that? It is and could be very much interpreted as just another request for accommodation like any other ADA request. Same thing with religious accommodation. I have a religious reason for not getting vaccinated. Can I still have the $25 gift card? Okay, we want to be sure that a manager is not just saying, heck no, that doesn't make any sense, right? Let's go through the process, let's document it, let's involve HR. All of the sort of standard, good old rules of thumb for dealing with accommodation requests are going to apply, frankly, whether or not this is a wellness program, regardless of what the EEOC says. Those are always going to be really good processes to fall back on. And my favorite thing as someone who tries to craft incentive programs, like I said from the very top of our call, is let's never lose sight of the bottom line. That's the whole point. We're trying to get people to do this. So we need to balance our commitment to complying with the desire to keep things available for folks who can't legitimately access the vaccine with also trying to incentivize the vaccine, right? So we might not want to announce from the rooftops, we're going to give everybody a gift card if you get vaccinated. And also if you don't get vaccinated, just come and let us know and we'll give you a gift card.
Sure.
We don't want to do that. It's not going to make any sense, right? But at the end of the day, that might be what we do. We might just say, okay, this woman's pregnant. She can't get the vaccine. It's just a $25 gift card. Let's just give it to her, right? And those are business decisions that you'll need to make internally with counsel. But being sure that you document that accommodation request process is going to cover a lot of the bases, I think.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And just, I think this is just like a quick add-on to that question, but we're having a couple of questions around like whether there's a difference between mandating or strongly encouraging. Do you put yourself at risk as an employer by saying strongly encourage, regardless of incentives?
Can I ask a second half of that question that someone texted me, which is the same question? The question was, if you encourage employees or you help them schedule appointments, does that change whether or not the status, whether it's more perceived of as mandatory or change your position as an employer?
I don't know. I am never going to hesitate to say when I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. And honestly, my guess isn't going to matter. The only answer that matters is what a judge says. So
And we'd rather not go there. We'd rather have
yeah,
none of our clients be test cases.
this is definitely true. I'm going to fall back on that, can't give legal advice in a webinar thing. The answer to that question should be privileged.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Good non-answer.
Excellent, thank you. So this is a couple, we've a bunch of great questions coming in. A couple of questions probably for you, Roslyn, about exclusions and record keeping. That's what I'm going to call the next couple of questions that we've got. So the first is, given what you just said, which is that we're saying we're hearing from the CDC not to exclude or that we're not going to change exclusions for vaccinated employees. So right now, we at this time, given the fact that we don't have any studies about whether or not you can transmit the virus when you're vaccinated, do you think that will deter employees from sharing their vaccine records if they don't feel like there's a value to it for them?
Well, there's a legal question there, which is, can you require employees to share their vaccine information if you're going to incentivize it or pay them for their time to get vaccinated? And that's a bit out on my bailiwick. I will tell you that our clients are asking their employees for documentation, that we are not seeing much hesitancy amongst employees in sharing that information about getting vaccinated. Actually, we're seeing very, very little hesitancy in sharing the information. We're seeing vaccine hesitancy, but not sharing hesitancy. We have several clients who are very, very careful on how they're controlling that information. The way that our wellness checks work are that when an employee takes an electronic wellness check before they go to work, they complete a survey. The surveys change based on changing guidance and travel requirements and so forth. And they get a green check mark and they can show their manager when they go into work. If they fail the survey, they get a red X and they start chatting with our clinical team. Our clinical team, when we have that vaccine information, will see that in front of them when they're chatting with an employee. So for now, the most important thing is when they tell us that they got vaccinated and today they have a low-grade fever and body aches and we know they got vaccinated yesterday, we're not going to exclude them for 10 days today. We're going to exclude them for the rest of today or today and tomorrow until their vaccine side effects passed. If they tell us that they have new cough, shortness of breath, loss of taste and smell, and they got vaccinated 7 days ago, then we are going to exclude them. So we think there's reasons to keep that information, know that information. When we keep it, we're keeping it secured following HIPAA standards, even though there's a HIPAA waiver on much of this. And that was probably way more of an answer than.
Well, and I'll add for my part, we do have some guidance from, I think from the EEOC, but gosh, I wish I could actually say that for sure, that you can ask an employee whether they've been vaccinated or to provide proof of vaccination in connection with an incentive program. The real key, though, is if there's a follow-up question. If they've said, no, I haven't been vaccinated, we want to be sure that employees or our manager and our HR folks are cautious about avoiding asking why. Except for in that accommodation discussion that we alluded to before, right? So, and then like you said, ensuring that any record of that information is kept confidentially through those procedures as well.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, in that answer, you answered like my next 3 questions that I had queued up.
Oh, good.
So great work. So we are getting a couple of questions. I'll probably tee this one up to you, Roslyn, around state by state vaccination. We know it's a nightmare. We've spent a couple of our last webinars talking about it. For our clients who have, businesses in multiple states, it is just like a Sisyphean task to try to keep it. Claire, one of the reasons we found Littler Mendelson and found you and got connected was that Littler has some great resources for employers about vaccination. So we'll share that out afterward. But for those of us on this who get the COVID briefing every Tuesday and Friday, we shared the link to their vaccine tracking a few weeks ago. That was really, really helpful.
I'm glad to hear it.
And such a I do not envy the people who keep that up to date, but it is
It's a
very,
thing of
very
beauty.
accurate so far. It is a thing of beauty, exactly. So we know that that's an issue. One thing we're hearing about is as essential workers are starting to be included into current phases of rollout. We just talked about restaurant workers getting rolled into 1B in certain places. Any news on what employees will need to show to prove that they're an essential employer?
Good. Yes.
And what are others doing for that?
Good question. In some states, you're asked for nothing to show that you're an employee. I was vaccinated in Connecticut. I showed my driver's license and my QR code for my vaccination appointment, and that was it. They never even asked what I did, why I was in 1A, and all those kinds of things. Yet we have other clients who have relayed to us that their employees not only wouldn't a employee ID or a paycheck stub work, but they needed a letter that documented they were an employee, and there were certain states that are requiring that. One of our clients has provided a letter like that to all of their employees so that when they can register in the states that they're in, they can do that. I needed to supply one to one of my employees. We have employees in many states. An employee in Illinois needed a letter. None of those other things were good enough. It used to be that many of us had paycheck stubs, and that might serve the purpose in certain states, but many of your employees, you're paying them electronically. They can see their paychecks online. They don't have printers, so they don't print they have a difficult time printing their paycheck stub. Many of you don't have employee IDs. So that is an issue that you do need to keep track of. Your managers need to know what is required in your state or your jurisdiction. It may change actually by vaccination location within your, within a particular city. So the answer is, just like it is so difficult to keep track of what state is vaccinating, who, when, and how to schedule, and whether or not you need to upload employee rosters and those kinds of things, you also need to keep track of what identification they may need to get vaccinated, if any at all.
Mm-hmm. Great. And along those lines, as employers are starting to begin to wrap their minds around the vaccination process in each state, is there anything that employers should be doing right now proactively to share employee contact information or share their list of employees with states?
Again, back to the particular state. For our employees, because we're a Connecticut-based employer, we were able to upload our roster of clinicians across the country, and then they got an email through the VAM system from the CDC, which we talked a little bit about in yesterday's executive summary, and they received an email that they could schedule in their state or when they became eligible within their state. So again, back to the Littler Guide, we have several clients that have done a really amazing job of getting down to a county level detail. Arizona is an example where you have to register by county. And so that if you have 30 locations in Arizona and they're in 11 counties, you need to register 11 times. It really is variable. There are places where you need to upload entire employee rosters, other places that you don't. Sometimes it's statewide, sometimes it's countywide, sometimes it's within a municipality. So the answer is,
and
it's a mess.
Variable by industry too, right? Because there's certain state regulations are only going to apply to certain types of employers that they want to know who's vaccinated or not. Others, it's a private matter just for that employee and their doctor, right? So it's yeah, I mean, we certainly have a whole bunch of clients who wish that they could control when their employees are able to be vaccinated, but are continually disappointed in discovering that in fact they have very little control over that at all,
Right.
in the industries that they operate.
Right. And it's also very different from other vaccines. You're not going to your doctor to get vaccinated yet.
Yes.
You're not going to your local pharmacy to get vaccinated. Even though local pharmacies are now getting vaccine, it's not necessarily for their regular customers. It's for the appointment scheduled through either the state or the local scheduling system and the like. So it really is still a mess. We are seeing more National Guard and military-based large vaccination clinics. And I am of the opinion the more of those that we see, the faster we're going to streamline all of this. We took vaccinations out of the hands of the people that usually do mass vaccinations. I've been involved in mass vaccinations, particularly flu vaccines, for 20 years. And we know how to give 150 million people flu shots every year. And we're not following that methodology now, which is creating some roadblocks and speed bumps and challenges.
I'll say that the sort of, I hope we can get to a new level of competency and functionality soon. I echo that same sentiment in terms of the development of the employment law that goes along with these issues. Those of us in employment law practice are just holding our breaths, waiting for a new version of the FFCRA. Because that's going to change all of this. And for those of you listening in, should really keep that in mind. In particular, the incentive programs. I would not be remotely surprised if a new version of the FFCRA that comes out in the next couple of weeks requires that FFCRA time be available for vaccination, that an employee can use their paid time off under the FFCRA for the time that they spend going to get a vaccine. So you'll want to keep that in mind. If right now you're scrambling to find a way to give people paid time off to get vaccinated, that might be an inevitability in only a matter of weeks. So just something to keep in mind, that every day that we wake up, the law on COVID employment is different.
Well, what we've been saying for now 11 plus months is every day in COVID is different.
Yes, it's true.
Every
It's
day
true.
has a different set of problems or set of challenges. So there's just another one.
Except I'm still in my house. That's the one thing that doesn't change. I never go anywhere.
And that's very regional.
Yeah, that's
And that's
true.
one of the things we're
That's true.
experiencing. In other regions, people are out more, and there's less, there's different regional perspectives on all of this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Excellent. So we have just a couple of questions left, although they're still trickling in, and just a few minutes left. So a couple of more clinical questions. A quick one that we have from our audience is for employees that have actually had lab confirmed COVID, they don't need to be excluded for close contact in 90 days. We're hearing more and more about that being extended. There's studies coming out that say 5 months, 8 months, that this natural immunity. Is there any idea when that 90 days might be extended?
No, we do know that it's something that's being looked at closely. We do expect we will get some better guidance or some changing guidance from the CDC on that. We are starting to get more clarification around many of these things. The World Health, back to something that Claire had said earlier about the CDC not recommending vaccination for pregnant women. Yesterday, the World Health, or last night, the World Health Organization changed their recommendation and removed the warnings for pregnant women, and felt the risk of COVID may be higher than the risk of vaccination. It'll be interesting to see if the CDC follows on that as well. But we do expect that the CDC will extend that 90 days, possibly to 180 days. There's also something else coming out about those who have been vaccinated, those who've had COVID may only need a single dose. So, and that's really been all over the media today and yesterday, with some very good studies that support that. So that's the other story we're following closely.
Great. So I think we probably have time for one more question. Do we have any idea? We're starting to hear, all the stuff about variants and boosters, and you mentioned annual shots. Any idea kind of where we are on that? Do we know when we'll need boosters, what that looks like?
We don't know what any of that looks like yet. I will tell you that there are a couple people, you've all heard me say this before. There are a couple people that I have followed very closely. Mike Osterholm at CIDRAP out of Minnesota is somebody who I read every day of the year, regardless of where I am, in the world. And those of you who saw him on the national news over the weekend feel, he described a Category 5 hurricane coming based on the variants. Mike has been right throughout all of this, and that certainly makes us nervous. We're hearing that the South African and Brazilian variants are particularly not responding well. The vaccine isn't responding well to them, although some are responding, some of the manufacturers are responding better than others. So the answer is no, we don't have any really good information about that. We do know Moderna is in the process of tweaking their vaccine and may have a modified version out as soon as within the month, and that would be very interesting to see. I will tell you that my public health peeps are really concerned about the variants and concerned about whether or not, if you've had COVID, you may not need to be excluded for 90 days right now. That might extend, or it might actually disappear if the variants become more widely circulating, as we expect that they will be. And that's really, somewhat devastating news. I did want to circle back to one other thing that Dr. Foster asked me to follow up on, which is that she talked about her husband and him not wanting, him having vaccine hesitancy and him being concerned about side effects after a flu shot. Sort of a quick sneak peek, it may be our best read in Friday's executive summary, but there's an incredibly great article in The Atlantic about how badly you feel after dose 2 should be a reason to celebrate. And if you feel really sick after dose 2, it means that your immune system did what it was supposed to do and is literally dancing. So
well, that's a great perspective.
It is. It's a great article. It's about reasons to celebrate when you feel lousy is basically the subject of the article.
The theme of the pandemic right there.
The theme of the pandemic. If you don't feel well after dose 2, even mild side effects, it's again a reason to celebrate. We're not hearing that much about terrible side effects after dose 2.
Great. Excellent. Well, it is 4 o'clock Eastern, so it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much to Claire Deason from Littler Mendelson, to Roslyn Stone from 0 Hour Health and Zedic. And thanks to all of you for all of your fabulous questions. We'll be back next month, March 3rd, with our next webinar. So we'll share out the recording after this as well, with the option to register for the next one. Any follow-up questions for Claire or for Dr. Foster, who joined us at the beginning, feel free to email them to us at jennp@getzedic.com. You can also reply to your registration. So don't hesitate to reach out, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.